Welcome, friends, to another edition of Global Capitalism, where we analyze the economic and political events shaping our world, not simply as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a system that is increasingly unable to meet the basic needs of its people. I am Richard Wolff. Today, we must turn our eyes to a tragedy that has unfolded in Canada, in a small community called Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. We are looking at a horrific event, a mass shooting at a high school, 10 lives lost, families shattered, a community of barely 2,000 people torn apart. And we are looking at the response, specifically the response of the political class represented by Prime Minister Mark Carney. It is a scene we have witnessed countless times, not just in Canada, but across the so-called advanced industrial nations, and most frequently, of course, in the United States. We see the tears. We hear the trembling voice of the leader. We watch the flags lowered to half-mast. And we must ask ourselves, with the seriousness that this loss of life demands, what is actually happening here? Why do we find ourselves stuck in this repetitive cycle of violence, followed by performative grief, followed by a return to the very conditions that produced the violence in the first place? To understand this, we have to look beyond the headlines. We have to look beyond the senseless act of violence narrative that the media feeds us. And we have to look at the structure of the society in which this violence occurs. When Mark Carney stands before the cameras, visibly emotional, speaking as a father and a citizen, he is performing a ritual that is essential to the maintenance of the status quo. He tells the people of Tumbler Ridge that Canada stands with you. He lists the foreign leaders from the UK, France, Norway, the UAE, who have sent their condolences. He frames the event as an inexplicable intrusion of darkness into an otherwise functional society. He says, there will be time for difficult questions, but not now. This is the standard refrain of the politician in a capitalist society facing the social disintegration caused by that very system. Not now. The implication is that grief is apolitical. The implication is that mourning is separate from understanding. But I tell you, you cannot mourn properly if you refuse to understand why the death occurred. To separate the tragedy from the system that produced it is not respect. It is an evasion. It is a way of protecting the system from the critique it deserves. The difficult questions are pushed into a future that never arrives, because to answer them would require confronting the deep structural failures of our economic and social organization. Let us look at Tumbler Ridge itself. The news reports describe it as a resilient, hard-working community, a town built by miners. This is crucial. This is a resource town. In the history of capitalism, specifically in North America, these towns are the engines of extraction. They are created to pull value out of the earth, coal, minerals, timber, to feed the profits of corporations often headquartered thousands of miles away. The people who live there, the workers, are viewed by the system as inputs, just like the machinery. When the market booms, the town booms. When the market busts, the town is left to rot. We have seen this story play out in the Rust Belt of the United States, in the coal fields of Wales, and in the resource towns of Canada. This economic precarity, this sense that your community's existence depends on the whims of a global market you cannot control, creates a profound psychological pressure. It creates anxiety. It creates a sense of abandonment. Now, I'm not saying that the price of coal directly caused a shooter to pull a trigger. That is vulgar reductionism. But we must understand the soil in which these weeds grow. We are living in a time of late-stage capitalism where the social contract is broken. The promise that if you work hard, you will be safe, you will be prosperous, your children will have a better life, that promise has been broken for decades. And when you strip a community of its economic security, when you turn human beings into commodities to be used and discarded, you fracture the social bonds that hold people together. You create alienation. Alienation is a concept Marx developed to explain how workers are separated from the fruits of their labor, but in the modern context, it goes much deeper. It is an alienation from one another. It is a profound loneliness. We hear in the report that Tumbler Ridge is close-knit, that everyone knows everyone. And yet, a violence of this magnitude exploded from within. This tells us that even in these small communities, the pressures of modern life, the financial stress, the lack of future prospects, the intense competition, the cultural glorification of violence as a solution to problems are penetrating the social fabric. The shooter was not an alien invader. The shooter was a product of this society. When Carney says Tumbler Ridge represents the very best of Canada, he is trying to reassure the nation that the violence is an anomaly. But the uncomfortable truth we must face is that this violence is becoming a characteristic feature of our society. It is what happens when you have a system that prioritizes profit over people, that valorizes hyper-individualism, and that systematically dismantles the social safety nets that support mental health and community well-being. Consider the response regarding mental health support. The government promises long-term support and financial assistance. We have heard this before. In the immediate aftermath, resources flood in, but capitalism operates on efficiency and profit maximization. Long-term, expensive mental health care for a traumatized community does not generate profit. It is a cost. And history tells us that once the cameras leave, once the breaking news banner fades, the support dries up. The austerity logic returns. The community is left to resilience, which is a polite political word for you are on your own. We have to look at the history of these mass casualty events, from the massacre in Montreal at the École Polytechnique to the shooting in Nova Scotia to this latest horror in BC. Each time the narrative is the same: shock, grief, promises of support, and then a return to business as usual. Why? Because to truly stop this violence would require a radical restructuring of our society. It would require guaranteeing every person economic security so that despair does not take root. It would require a culture that values human life over the accumulation of property. It would require decommodifying mental health care so that it is a right, not a privilege. Prime Minister Carney, in his tearful address, is acting as the mourner-in-chief. This is a role that has become increasingly central for leaders in the West. As they lose the power to actually control the economy, having ceded that power to multinational corporations and banks, they are left with only the symbolic power of the state. They cannot guarantee you a job. They cannot guarantee you affordable housing. They cannot guarantee your pension. So what can they do? They can hug you when tragedy strikes. They can cry with you. They can lower the flag. This performance of empathy is a substitute for the exercise of power. It is designed to make you feel that the state cares, even as the state presides over an economic system that is indifferent to your survival. When he says, Canada mourns with you, he is creating an abstract unity, the nation, to paper over the very real divisions and inequalities that define the actual lives of Canadians. It is a way of saying, we are all in this together, when economically We are very much not in this together. The billionaire executives of the mining companies are not in this with the unemployed worker in Tumbler Ridge. They live in different worlds. And this tragedy, as horrific as it is, exposes those cracks. We must also look at the global dimension Carney brings up. He mentions the solidarity of France, the UK, India, the UAE. This is the global club of capitalist managers reassuring one another. It is a diplomatic courtesy, yes, but it also reinforces the idea that this is a global phenomenon of senseless violence that no one can control. By framing it as a tragedy that the whole world mourns, they universalize it, making it seem like a natural disaster, like an earthquake or a flood. But a mass shooting is not a natural disaster. It is a social disaster. It is a human-made disaster. And because it is human-made, it can be unmade. But it cannot be unmade by the same thinking, the same institutions, and the same economic relations that created the conditions for it. We have to be willing to look at the dark underbelly of this best of Canada rhetoric. We have to ask, what is happening to the young men in our societies? What is the level of despair required to walk into a school and kill? This is not just evil. Evil is a religious category, not an analytical one. It shuts down thought. We need to think materially. We need to think sociologically. We need to understand that a society that is built on competition, on dominance, on the survival of the fittest, produces individuals who feel they must dominate or die. The historical context of the company town or the resource town is vital here. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the company controlled everything: your house, your store, your church, your school. In the 21st century, the direct control is gone, but the dependency remains. When that dependency is threatened by global markets, by automation, by environmental shifts, the community experiences a collective trauma. The resilience Carney praises is actually the scar tissue of a community that has been battered by economic forces beyond its control. To ask them to be resilient again in the face of this slaughter is a heavy burden. It is the burden placed on the working class everywhere. You must suffer the consequences of a system you did not design, and you must do it with dignity and strength while we, the leaders, offer you tears and flags. This is the limitation of the liberal response to tragedy. It offers comfort, but it does not offer change. It offers charity, but not justice. And that is why we are here having this conversation, and why, tragically, unless we change the system, we will be having it again. We need to move from the what and the who, the details of the shooting, the name of the suspect, to the why and the how. How is our society structured? Why does it produce this? That is the work we must do. If we are serious about understanding and ending tragedies like the one in Tumbler Ridge, we have to pull back the curtain on how capitalism organizes daily life, because that is where the roots lie. Look at the institutions that structure the lives of the students, parents, and workers in that town. The school is not an island. It is integrated into a society organized around hierarchy and competition. Children are trained from an early age to accept that authority flows from the top down. The principal over the teachers over the students, the manager over the worker, the boss over the subordinate. They are taught that their worth is measured by grades, test scores, and later by wages and job titles. At no point are they invited into a democratic process concerning the very institutions that govern their lives. They do not vote on what they study, how the school is run, or how decisions are made. They are being prepared quite consciously to occupy subordinated positions in a corporate economy where decisions about investment, technology, hiring, firing, and relocation are made by a small group at the top. That is the daily indoctrination. It is the normalization of powerlessness. Think, too, about the role of masculinity in all this. While not every shooter is male, the overwhelming majority are. Why? Because capitalism did not emerge into a vacuum. It emerged into and reinforced patriarchal structures. The traditional male role, provider, protector, controller, has been eroded by economic insecurity. When the mind closes, when wages stagnate, when jobs are casualized, the promise held out to men that they will be in control of their lives and their families is broken. Some respond with depression, some with addiction, some with withdrawal. A tiny, dangerous minority respond with violence. The culture has told them that to be a man is to dominate. When they can no longer dominate economically, they sometimes turn to the only other sphere where dominance is dramatized: physical force. The gun is not just a tool, it is a symbol of power. It is a brutal shortcut to the feeling of control that the economic system constantly denies them. Consider the way politicians talk in the aftermath. Carney says, "There will be time for difficult questions, but not now." Let me be blunt. That is exactly backward. If not now, when? When the pain has dulled, when the cameras have gone home, when the urgency has faded. In practice, not now means never. The time when the public might be willing to contemplate structural change is precisely in the wake of a shock, when the cracks are visible, when the old reassurances no longer ring true. To insist that asking systemic questions is somehow disrespectful to the dead is a cruel inversion. The most profound respect we can show to the victims is to make sure fewer people die in the future. That requires asking why this keeps happening, and it requires answers that go beyond the individual pathology of one shooter. Let us also interrogate the idea that politics should be kept out of mourning. You will hear again and again that this is not the time for politicization, but politics is simply the struggle over how we organize our shared life. A mass killing in a school is itself the result of political choices about mental health funding, about gun regulations, about economic policy, about urban and regional planning, about the social safety net. To forbid politics in the aftermath is to forbid discussing the very choices that made the tragedy possible. It is, in effect, to protect the existing political economic order from scrutiny at the moment when its failures are most obvious. That is not about respect, it is about power. I want to dwell for a moment on the language used in these official addresses: resilience, healing, community, strength. These are beautiful words. They are also, in the mouths of politicians and corporate media, deeply ideological. When they praise resilience, they are praising the capacity of ordinary people to endure suffering without demanding structural change. Resilience is necessary, of course. People must go on living, raising children, caring for one another. But notice that we never praise the resilience of bankers whose bonuses have been cut. We never praise the resilience of CEOs whose stock options took a temporary hit. Resilience is what we demand of those at the bottom when those at the top refuse to share the burden. It becomes a kind of moral obligation imposed on the victims. You must bounce back. You must be strong. You must carry on, while we tweak rhetoric and keep the system intact. The same goes for healing. Healing is not an apolitical process. If the conditions that cause the wound remain unchanged, the wound will be reopened again and again. Healing properly understood requires transformation. When a doctor treats a disease, they do not merely alleviate pain, they seek to remove the cause. Imagine a doctor who tells a patient, "Your pain is real and I am with you. Let's lower the lights, play some music, and maybe in a few weeks, when it doesn't hurt quite so much, we can think about whether we need to change anything in your life." You would call that malpractice. Yet that is how our leaders treat social disease. They manage the pain, they narrate the grief, but they do not remove the cause, because the cause implicates the economic system from which they derive their power and privileges. The violence we see in schools is part of a broader spectrum of violence that capitalism normalizes. Think of the violence of homelessness in a wealthy country. Think of the violence of denying medication to someone because they cannot pay. Think of the violence of chronically underfunded schools, crumbling infrastructure, poisoned water. These are slow violences, not captured by breaking news banners, but they kill and maim far more people than a single horrific event. When we see a mass shooting, we are seeing a concentrated eruption of a violence that is normally diffuse and hidden in everyday life. The shooter, in a twisted way, is acting out the logic of a system that routinely sacrifices human beings to profit. We recoil from their act, and we should, but we rarely recoil with equal intensity from the structural violence that quietly destroys lives in less spectacular ways. In Canada, as in many countries, there's a comforting narrative that we are not like the United States when it comes to gun violence. There are differences in gun laws, yes, and those matter. But a capitalist Canada integrated into the same global financial system, adopting similar neoliberal policies of privatization, deregulation, and austerity, will converge over time in social outcomes with its southern neighbor. You cannot import the economic model and imagine you are immune to its social consequences. The precarious gig worker in Toronto, the indebted student in Vancouver, the laid-off miner in Tumbler Ridge, they share more with their counterparts in Ohio or West Virginia than with the comfortable elite in either country. If you want to reduce violence, you must reduce the social and economic desperation that feeds it. Tightening or loosening gun laws may influence the means of violence, but it does not address the underlying motive forces: alienation, humiliation, hopelessness. Let me be very specific about what a systemic response would look like, as opposed to the cosmetic response we usually see. First, economic security must be treated as a right, not a privilege or a reward. That means a job guarantee, or at minimum, a robust public sector prepared to employ people in socially necessary work: infrastructure renewal, environmental cleanup, elder care, child care, cultural work. A society in which adults have stable, meaningful work is a society in which the next generation grows up with less fear and anxiety. Second, universal, decommodified mental health care must be built into the public system, just as we expect public education. If therapy and psychiatric care are available only to those who can pay or who fight through bureaucratic mazes, we are leaving millions to suffer alone until they break. Third, we must democratize our workplaces. Worker cooperatives, co-determination, and other forms of economic democracy are not utopian experiments. They are practical ways to give people real control over their daily lives, reducing the sense of helplessness that can curdle into rage. Fourth, education must be transformed from a sorting mechanism for the labor market into a space for developing critical, engaged human beings. That means teaching students to understand capitalism not as a natural given, but as one historical way of organizing production and distribution, with strengths and weaknesses, with alternatives. It means including in the curriculum the history of social movements, labor struggles, anti-racist and feminist organizing, so that young people know they are part of a long tradition of people who confronted injustice without resorting to violence. If you teach only individual achievement and competition, you should not be surprised when individuals either break under the pressure or explode in destructive ways. Finally, we must challenge the ideological role of politicians like Carney when they present themselves as grieving parents first and leaders second. I do not doubt that he feels genuine sorrow, but his job is not to be the nation's therapist. His job in a democracy is to organize collective action to change the conditions of life. When he says this is not the time for questions, he is abdicating that responsibility. The correct response would be, this is precisely the time for questions. This is the time to examine what we have done and failed to do as a government and as a society. This is the time to ask how our economic policies, our budget priorities, our social programs, or lack thereof, contributed to a situation in which such despair and violence could emerge. A serious leader would invite criticism, not deflect it. A serious media would demand plans, timelines, legislation, not just sound bites and solemn tones. So when you hear leaders like Mark Carney speak with tears in their eyes, listen carefully. Ask yourself, where are the policies? Where is the willingness to confront the economic order that underlies so much of our social distress? If all you hear is sorrow without transformation, mourning without movement, then you are witnessing not leadership, but theater. We do not need better performers. We need a different system. Until we face that, until we organize around that, tragedies like the one in Tumbler Ridge will remain, sadly, not unthinkable at all, but all too predictable. And that, in my view, is the real obscenity. To honor the dead, then, let us refuse to be satisfied with ritual. Let us insist on analysis, on accountability, on alternatives. Let us connect the dots between grief and the economic arrangements that make grief so frequent. And let us be clear, another kind of society is possible, one that does not ask its children to pay with their lives for the failures of capitalism.